Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here this morning. What I want to talk about, there's a little bit of overlap with what Paul was saying, but I suppose I'm more of a macroeconomist than a microeconomist, so I'm going to start by looking at the global backdrop, what's happening there, because at the end of the day, Ireland's ability to emerge from the current darkness, I think, will be largely driven by the export side of the economy. And that was the golden period of Ireland's recent economic performance during the 1990s. The Celtic Tiger period was an export-driven phenomenon, and that supported domestic demand, construction activity and all the rest. Unfortunately, after 2000, we lost sight of the fact that we are a small open economy, that exports are extremely important. We became focused on consumer demand, on building houses for each other, bringing in workers from overseas to build houses, which they were in turn going around and renting from each other. So we created a very, very dubious economic model in the 2000s. So we really have to get back, in my view, to the model of the 1990s, where exports were the biggest driver and they supported domestic economic activity. So obviously, the global backdrop is extremely important. I'm going to talk about the status of the Irish economy, where it is at the moment, what the outlook is, what in my view needs to be done at a macro level, and finally I just want to conclude by saying a few things about tackling youth unemployment. I suppose the first thing we need to recognise from a statistical viewpoint is that globally and indeed domestically we have lived through an incredibly difficult and pretty unprecedented period of economic collapse over the last 3 years. And I just run through a few graphs of GDP growth very quickly, just to demonstrate the magnitude of what we've lived through. You can see out there on the right hand side the big bars coming down into negative territory. Out there on the left hand side you can see the dot-com recession, which was a little bit of a pussycat in relative terms. What we've been living through over the last 2 or 3 years is a real recession. It's a decent recession. That's a joke, okay? It really is big stuff. This is what happened in the Eurozone, exactly the same mirror image. You know, a literal collapse in economic activity over a 2-year period. This is the situation in the United Kingdom. Very, very similar story. Literal collapse in economic activity. This is the German situation, and I would certainly believe that the Germans have done a lot correct over the last decade in terms of restructuring their economy, in terms of working on the competitiveness agenda. But, you know, despite that fact, you can see the pain that the German economy experienced as well over the last couple of years. So no economies in the developed world were immune from the difficulties that we've just lived through. Where are we today? Well, the backdrop as I see it, you know, the world economy and the global financial system has become a little bit more stable after an incredible shock. Interestingly, I see this morning that a trader in Soc Gen in Paris has been jailed for 3 years over trading losses. So at least in some parts of the world, they know how to treat people who create national sabotage, but that's another issue. Maybe we'll get there. We'll see over the next couple of years. But anyway, you know, the global economy and financial system, we have come back from the abyss. We have seen in the last 12 months some recovery in economic activity. You know, statistically, the US, the UK, the Eurozone are growing. China and the emerging world growing pretty strongly at the moment. There are serious issues in the developed world. You know, we have high levels of public debt in many countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, large parts of continental Europe, big government deficits that will have to be reined in over the next 2 or 3 years. And I think I've never, in my experience, seen such a divergence of views amongst the global macroeconomics community about the correct approach to this government debt problem. You know, should we, on one side of the coin, we have people arguing that there is no choice other than to increase taxes, cut government expenditure to try and restore stability to public finances. But on the other side of the coin, led by economic luminaries like Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, They argue that what is required at this stage is actual fiscal stimulus rather than fiscal contraction. So that debate rages on, and as economists do, they'll continue to debate it, and the rest of the world will get on with it. But it is, there is a big issue with government debt that will have to be tackled over the next few years. There's also a big issue with private sector debt, particularly in the United States. Coming into this recession, the US personal balance sheet was in a very, very poor state of health. So that personal balance sheet restructuring is going to have to happen. And indeed, it is happening in this country. As I'll be discussing in a few minutes, what we have seen in the last 12 months in this country is a significant pickup in personal savings. So people are saving, they're not spending. So from an economic perspective, that means economic activity is being depressed to some extent. But anyway, those are some of the problems in the developed world: big government deficits, high levels of private or personal debt, high levels of unemployment, and also, governments are going to be forced over the next couple of years to withdraw the stimulus that has been thrown into the global economic system over the last couple of years. But we're not there yet, and I think anybody who believes that the developed world has come through the worst of its problems is being a little bit naive. Indeed, this morning, the Bank of Japan cut its overnight interest rate back to 0 to 0.1% range. So 2 weeks ago, the US Federal Reserve suggested it was going to recommence quantitative easing of money supply to try and stimulate the US economy. So the global economy is getting better, but it's happening at a very gradual basis. There are lots of problems to be overcome over the next couple of years. So from Ireland's perspective, it certainly does mean that while the external environment will be somewhat better, it is not going to be the sort of external demand environment that we lived through up to 2006. So a challenging global backdrop. And I suppose the good news is that against that sort of background, official interest rates are going to remain at historic lows for the foreseeable future. Moving on to the Irish economic situation, where is the Irish economy today? Well, I suppose I would characterise Ireland as an economy that came into the beginning of 2008, literally hit a brick wall and died. 2008, 2009, over 12% has been knocked off our GDP. To my knowledge, that is the biggest contraction in economic activity in any developed economy over a 2-year period. So it's been an absolutely incredible economic shock. This year, there are signs that things have started to stabilise, and I suppose it does prove the law of gravity that nothing falls forever. Having fallen off the cliff over a 2-year period, there's a sense that we've hit the ground and that we are starting to bounce along the bottom at the moment. We know, for example, in the first 8 months of the year, retail sales back in positive growth, up by 1.8%. Interestingly, and this has huge employment consequences in the retail sector, for example, while volumes are rising, the value of sales is still in negative territory. So retailers are being forced to cut prices to shift product. That creates a difficult business model. Consumer confidence, extremely fragile. Rising unemployment, jobs cuts, tax increases, the cost of the banking bailout that was revealed last week. Lots of reasons why Irish consumers are extremely concerned about the future. The manufacturing side of the economy is growing, up by 4.6%, but it is a mixed picture. The multinational side of the manufacturing base, dominated by the IT sector, chemical and pharma, doing very well. Indigenous manufacturing, the performance is much more difficult. And unfortunately, from an employment perspective, Indigenous manufacturing is a much more important generator of job creation than the multinational side, because the growth we're seeing in the multinational side is being driven by productivity rather than increased employment. So you could go through 2 or 3 years of strong growth in the multinational sector without any impact on employment creation. Likewise, exports were doing okay, but it is dominated by the multinational sector, the indigenous exporters finding life more difficult. Credit is not flowing in the economy, despite what the banking sector is telling us. credit is not available for the vast bulk of people and businesses who want to borrow. And banks are being criticised over this. You hear people talking about the bank's unwillingness to lend money. That is incorrect. The reality is that the banks are not unwilling to lend money. They are unable to lend money because technically most of our banking system is insolvent at this stage, and but for the state intervention in trying to recapitalise, at least 2 of our banks would be gone at this stage. So and this is the really depressing thing about last week, that all of the money that's been pumped into the banking system, that is trying to restore solvency to the banking system, trying to restore the capital base. It is not going to result in credit flowing in the economy for the foreseeable future. So credit availability is a huge issue. I believe that the existing banking system will not be capable of pumping credit into the economy over the next couple of years at least. So I think we need to look at an alternative banking model. So I would be suggesting that we need to look at creating a new bank specifically targeted at the SME sector of the economy, capitalised by the state. Tax revenues still extremely weak. We saw again yesterday the figures up to the end of September, but at least it is starting to stabilise. So, just to summarise it, in the first half of the year, GDP down by 1.3%, GNP down by 4.5%. That actually does represent stabilisation after a couple of absolutely dreadful years for the economy. So in other words, I think we've stopped falling, we're bouncing along the bottom. This is the graphical characterisation of a decent recession. You can see there 2008, the literal collapse in economic activity, dramatic stuff. Likewise on the retail sales side, you can see the collapse that occurred, but over the last few months starting to move back into positive territory again. This is consumer confidence still at extremely fragile levels. This is the unemployment situation, an absolutely dramatic deterioration in a labour market over a very short space of time. Looking at the other side of the job market equation, what's been happening on the employment front, and I've taken the most up-to-date figures in employment up to the end of June of this year. The middle column there are the sectoral changes in employment over the last 12 months, and the right-hand column, the sectoral changes in employment over the last 24 months. And you can see there on a 24-month perspective, the vast bulk of sectors in the private sector have had massive job losses. Construction has now fallen 54% from its peak, for example. Financial services, we're talking about 1,900 jobs there. I think the financial services sector is actually playing catch up in terms of job creation. And you can see over the last 12 months, 5,500 jobs lost in the financial service sector. So I suppose just to go through that, you can see sector by sector within the private sector, massive job losses over the last 24 months.